All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with a very, very special guest. I'm here with Michael Steinberger to discuss The Philosopher in the Valley, his latest book. Michael, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
This is going to be a really exciting conversation because I have been a fan of Palantir for a long time. I've been intrigued by the company. A lot of my audience has obviously cared about the company. The company's developed a pretty significant retail shareholder base. And you essentially did a book on the life of Karp, but also the story of Palantir. And so I think there's a lot of different nuances to get into in terms of how this book even came to be and why you chose to write about this subject. I want to start with this question to get things rolling. You served as a wine columnist for the internet magazine Slate from
Yes.
2002 to 2011. And the interesting thing about wine, I'm not the biggest wine drinker, but from my friends who do drink wine, there's a certain spiritual way that people like to drink and analyze and smell, and there's all this nuance to the concept of wine. You wrote a book about someone who is very enigmatic, and
Yeah.
one could argue, there's a lot of psychoanalysis that comes to understand the philosopher in the valley that is Alex Karp. Do you think your 10 years of writing about wine kind of influenced how you approached writing about Alex Karp?
It's a great question, and I hadn't actually thought of that. It's interesting. He brings up my background with wine writing quite often. In fact, he says, he's made points that, it's just like, talking about, he'll say a grape, and he, said, if you don't like, even if you don't like this particular grape, you seem able to write about it quite fairly. Now, I once wrote a piece expressing my disdain for Sauvignon Blanc. I don't think Sauvignon Blanc fans would think that piece was particularly fair, but nevertheless, Karp thought, I was able to write about things with a certain even-handedness, putting my feelings aside. It's as for whether writing about wine was good preparation for this, maybe. I mean, wine is a complicated subject. There are a lot of dimensions to it. You're also dealing with something, where people have strong feelings. It's a matters of personal taste. And maybe in some way that I didn't quite understand, there was decent preparation for writing about someone as complex and different as Karp. He's something different on the global business scene, and there are dimensions to him that you perhaps don't find in other more standard issue CEOs. So I think there's something to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons why a lot of retail investors became intrigued with Karp is because of how interesting he was. Even when the company stock price was not performing, a lot of people liked to listen to what he had to say. And one of the sort of major themes in your book is that you noticed Karp has a way to get other people to listen to him, even if they don't agree with him. And
Yeah.
that I think is one of the hardest things for any leader to be able to establish the ability to get people to care about what they have to say, because it forces
Yeah.
some level of, hey, this person matters. Maybe we should take them seriously. And in the business world, that can result in potentially billions and billions of dollars of revenue. Let's get into how you and Karp originally met. So one of the main characters, I would say, of the book is Haverford College, where you both actually went to the same class. There's only about 1,500 students there, but you didn't end up reconnecting until decades later. Can you kind of tell the story of how you got to know?
Well, it's even more than that. We went to this small liberal arts school outside of Philadelphia. So class size of fewer than 400 people. We spent 4 years there and never once exchanged a word.
Wow.
That's a kind of achievement in itself. I have no idea how that happened. I think he was, he downplays how hard he worked there, but I think he worked pretty hard. I am quite certain the library saw more of him than it saw of me, which perhaps goes some way to explaining how he ended up a billionaire and I didn't. But it's very strange because, for instance, my wife went to Bryn Mawr College, and Haverford and Bryn Mawr are very close. They're like brother and sister school. Haverford's fully co-ed. It turned co-ed. It went fully co-ed in 1980, so a few years before we got there. But,
Mm.
they still keep very close ties. My wife knew him. We had mutual friends. Somehow he and I just never never exchanged a word there. And so, cut to all these years later, I had become aware of Palantir and had become aware of its CEO. And oh, he was in my class at Haverford. Interesting. And I'd be lying if I said when I saw pictures of him that I was like, oh, I remember that guy, because that's just not true. Anyway, so I had become a writer for the New York Times Magazine. I had moved on from wine and started writing about non-wine subjects for the New York Times Magazine. And, I thought, Palantir would be a really compelling story. And, it's important that we did not have any prior relationship because, the magazine would not have assigned it because that would have been a conflict of interest.
Right.
We met for the first time in 2019. Off the record conversation, just, where, he was kind of sizing me up and deciding whether he wanted to cooperate on a magazine feature. And, we reminisced a bit about old times we never shared. And and from that, he agreed to cooperate on the story for the magazine, and I reported that story through 2019 and into 2020. It was published in 2020, a few weeks after Palantir went public.
Right.
And then, it was a pretty comprehensive article. It was 9,000 words, which is a lot of words. But as comprehensive as it was, it felt like there was still a lot more to say. I'd spent a lot of time with him reporting the story, was, very intrigued by him. I thought there was more to his story and more to the Palantir story. And so about a year after the article came out, I talked to him about the possibility of doing a book. I thought there was a timely and important book to be written about Palantir. And I went up to see him at his place in New Hampshire, and we talked about it, and then he was on board with it. So that's kind of how this whole thing happened. And he agreed to cooperate, and I think he cooperated for a couple of different reasons. He assumed at that point that a book would be written about Palantir, and he thought it made sense to cooperate with a writer. He thought the Times Magazine story was fair. He thought it did a good job of capturing who he was and how he thought about the world. So it made sense to cooperate with someone he had worked with before. And I think the other factor that interested him in having a book written was because, look, he'd taken the company public. Palantir was a success story, and he wanted to be recognized as the driving force behind that success. Because, as you know, as someone who's followed the company as closely as you have, even to this day, you see a lot of articles. The headline and stories about Palantir is Peter Thiel's Palantir, and that was absolutely just like it was almost like a tick during the first Trump presidency. Almost every article
Right.
was Thiel's Palantir, even though Peter never had any involvement with the day-to-day workings of Palantir, chairman of the board, but it was Karp who was running the company. And I think that wasn't a source of resentment for Karp, but I think he wanted he wanted to be recognized as the person who built this company into the success story it had become.
He wanted a bit of the main character energy. There's a lot to dive into in terms of his past life, but at a high level, why do you think Karp wanted to be recognized as the main character outside of the obvious? He's the CEO, he's responsible for the company actually getting to where it is on a day to day. But was there something deeper for why he wanted to be seen as that guy? Because now he objectively is that guy.
Yeah. No, I think it's, listen, you can't be lacking in self-regard when you are in a position like this. And I think certainly taking this company public, having a successful public listing was a huge thing. And it had taken a long time to get to that point. And I think, just pure, and I don't want to say it's ego, but I think, he wanted to be, have his success acknowledged. He felt that there was, his path to Silicon Valley was a very improbable one. So I think, he recognized certainly that he had a very interesting story. And Palantir was just a very unlikely success in some ways.
Right.
So I think he just was eager to see that story told. He knew it was going to be told in book form by someone at some time. And so I happened to show up on his doorstep in New Hampshire and said, "Hey, I would like to take this on." And he thought about it and agreed to cooperate.
Do you think if you guys didn't go to the same school, he would have not cooperated?
That's a good question. I think, listen, I think the Haverford connection, they weren't doing a lot of press back in 2019. So I think, the Haverford connection, I don't know this to be, I don't know that this is absolutely the case, but I think the Haverford connection intrigued him enough that he was willing to take a meeting with me to discuss about whether he wanted, the story I was interested in doing for the magazine. I think the Haverford connection helped in that regard. I don't think it had anything to do with the book, though Haverford figures very prominently in the book for reasons that Haverford may not entirely love. But I think I don't think it had much to do with the book, but it may have had something to do with his willingness to entertain the possibility of cooperating on the Times Magazine story.
Right. Okay, so let's dive deeper into Alex Karp and his early life, and then we'll get into the transition to Palantir. So there's two elements of the book that you highlighted pretty well, which was his biracial identity
Mhm.
and his learning disability, which was dyslexia. I want to start with the biracial identity, and then we'll work our way towards the dyslexia. A lot of people in the Palantir community that I speak to don't even know that Karp is half black. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
many of them don't even know he's Jewish, and so like there's a variety of nuance to the concept of being interracial in and of itself. So, and then on top of that, adding the Jewish component to it from a religious perspective. What is your perspective on how Karp thought of himself being biracial, and how do you think that identity either propelled him or provided him a disadvantage over the course of his career?
I would say this. I think, yeah, he understood early on that, being biracial, being Jewish, being severely dyslexic, were not advantages in life. That's, there were strikes against him. Racism was certainly a factor. And though he says he never experienced racism himself, he certainly knew that it was a major factor in American life and just part of the world in which we lived. And certainly anti-Semitism was a significant force, has been a significant force throughout history. So he kind of understood early on that he had some strikes against him as he perceived it. And I would say, that with Palantir, I think the thing you have to understand with him, and maybe it doesn't come across when it's on television or in his public pronouncements, but I think he's had a sense of vulnerability from a quite young age, um, because of his identity.
Mm,
Didn't consider it a burden, but just understood that, racism, anti-Semitism were factors in life, were things he might face in life. And I think there was a sense of vulnerability that has stuck with him to the present day. And with Palantir, I do think part of the motivation for getting involved with this company, for seeing this company through to the success was, in some sense, he was making the world safe for Alex Karp in his mind. And I
right.
think that is it's a strange thing to say now about a guy who, is a multi-billionaire, has a big security detail. It's like, what does he have to fear? But I think that sense of vulnerability has stuck with him. It propels a lot of a lot of the decision making at Palantir, the fear that sort of, that he's always had. And so I think, this is kind of the way one might think about, his biracial background and his identity, that it is integral to what Palantir became in a sense.
There was a quote in the book from Karp saying to his brother that he focused more on the family's blackness, and Karp focused less on it. Why do you think Karp focused less on it?
It's a great question. Now, as his brother, who gave me a lot of time, was very, very generous with his time and his thoughts and his recollections and really, laid out the family history. He said that in high school and in college and college friends, people at Harvard who knew him, unlike me, substantiate this. He very much identified with his Black heritage. His brother said in high school he was a young Black man, and that continued through Haverford. He was, very involved with the Black student organization there. In fact, our senior year, he helped organize an anti-racism conference that was held at Yale University, I believe. And was quoted in the Detroit Free Press, which did a big article not long thereafter about racism on college campuses. And he's talking about how prevalent racism is and so forth. So, it is interesting that, he gets to Palantir, and it's not until many years after the company started that he told anyone at the company that his mother was Black.
Mm.
And as you said, I mean, he tells his brother at some point, this is well into he's now with Palantir, Palantir company's success, and they have a conversation, and then he said to his brother, you've dialed up the blackness, and I've dialed it back. I did not I do not offer any speculation in the book about why that is. I really felt, because this is kind of fraught terrain. It's matters of identity and how you think about these things. And you know, I was very content to put this information in there and to let the reader draw his or her own conclusion.
Well, I
Um,
do think there is one part of the book where Karp mentions to you in your conversations that he is not going through the same types of pain that a full 100%, you could say, black man is going through, not biracial. And there's a
yeah,
lot of different nuance to that, just in terms of how the world perceives Karp or how the world doesn't perceive Karp. And on top of that, I mean, based on how Karp has evolved over the years, even though I think this has been pretty true since he was a student, meritocracy is what he cares about a
yeah.
lot more than the sort of diversity, equity, inclusion standpoint. Do you think because of that, he didn't want to be treated as someone better or worse because of his blackness, which is why he focused on just being the best versus being the black best?
Well, I mean, listen, I mean, he, he feels that, that he doesn't feel that he would be accepted by the black community as one of their own. I think that is one issue that, and his experience has been different. I mean, he says he has never felt the sting of racism.
Yes.
So it would be, fraudulent of him to claim that he's had this or that he's experienced life the way, other black people have experienced life. He said that's not been my experience. And he doesn't disavow in any way his black heritage. He says he's proud of it, and that it's important to him. But he also feels that if he went out there and said I'm black and you know, put that at the center of his identity, that the black community would not accept it, that it would be offensive to people. And so this is his explanation, for why he's not centering it in his life in the way that his Jewishness is now very much center. It's different,
Yeah.
and these are the reasons he offers. And as I said, this is identity is particularly in this particular moment, it's a fraught topic, and people are going to draw their own conclusions, and I'm really interested to see how readers react to this and what they make of it and what they make of his trajectory and the fact that his brother says in high school and in college he was a young black man, and now it's it's the Jewish side that he emphasizes, and the Jewish side that clearly matters more to him.
Right. Learning disability. How do you think I mean, this guy got a PhD in neoclassical theory while having dyslexia. I mean, how did your conversations around that learning disability with Karp accentuate how you think of him as a entrepreneur, leader, ultimately founder?
Well, he says, picking up from the conversation about identity. I mean, he says, look at dyslexia was the real hurdle in his life, not racism. He never experienced racism. Dyslexia was the real hurdle. And as he puts it, he's got a very colorful way of expressing himself. He said, "It fucked me, but gave me wings to fly." and, and what was very interesting, I did not know this, but there have been studies and there have been articles written. A disproportionate number of CEOs and successful entrepreneurs seem to be dyslexic. I don't know what the percentage is, but like Richard Branson, for instance, dyslexic, the famed attorney David Boyce, and then now Karp, and what we know, and what Karp explained to me, and research has borne this out. There's a couple of things about dyslexics. One, they can't process as much information in any given moment as other people, so they get by on less information, and that can lead to being able to act more quickly on the information they have. And that's certainly the way he feels. So he can, make decisions, reach conclusions based on less information, and which enables him to act more decisively, more quickly and decisively. And he thinks that has been absolutely integral to the success he's had as a CEO. And the other factor is, you know, dyslexics, it is a disability and you need help from other people. And, you can't have this sort of, self-reliance is not, something you can really have. And, you know, when you get into you're building a company, you have to delegate, you have to get other people involved. It's not this, me, myself, and I. I think with a lot of companies, particularly when you have entrepreneurs, you have founders. One would assume this is their baby. They are emotionally and financially invested in it, and it's probably really hard for them to delegate responsibility. And in the case of someone like Karp, he is used to having, because he needed help before, and and so, he's used to working the idea of working as a team and of delegating authority and of drawing on the strengths of other people is something that, he grew up with as a dyslexic. So, he believes that this has made him a more effective leader has been absolutely integral to Palantir's success.
Do you think that he almost sees it as a weapon that allows him to differentiate himself? I mean, Karp is someone who is not afraid to be different. He kind of really likes the fact that he's different. Do you think
Yeah.
that dyslexia makes him so different from a traditional academic that for him to survive in academia, he had to work twice as hard, which
Yeah.
ultimately implicated his life in Palantir?
I don't know about that, but I mean, I do know. I mean, obviously, just the fact that he had this learning disability and then goes on to I mean, he crushes it at Haverford. He goes on to Stanford Law, and then he goes and earns a doctorate at Goethe University, Frankfurt. I mean, with this disability, I mean, that's impressive. I mean, that's and as much as he downplays how hard he worked, I would imagine it was some Herculean efforts at points because of this. And so, I don't know that you know. I don't know that that how it's translated to Palantir, but I mean I think certainly and I don't know that I don't know that he does because he doesn't. I mean, he talks a bit about his dyslexia, but it's not something when he goes on CNBC or appears elsewhere, he doesn't really. He will occasionally mention it, but it's not something that he you know seems to particularly interested in calling attention to.
Right.
Um, so there are other factors, other things, but I think listen, I mean, privately and with his colleagues, I mean, he will certainly say that dyslexia is a very very big factor, and one of the things that has differentiated him as a leader.
Okay. So let's get into some of the conversation on Palantir, and then we'll get back to Karp himself. Um, I guess let's start with this question, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah.
Do you think people in the general public have an unfair understanding of what Palantir's technology actually does?
I think there are misconceptions. I mean, as well as I do, that the name Palantir is now almost synonymous with surveillance, and I'm not helping that with the subtitle of my book,
Which actually was a bit surprising to me. I didn't know that was going to be the subtitle.
Well, I will tell you. I mean, people at Palantir, Karp has seen the book, and other people have seen it, and they're not thrilled about that. I think it is, it is. They're not a surveillance technology company, but part of the work they do is to can enable surveillance. I mean, they can facilitate surveillance. Their software can help intelligence services with their work, and obviously it was a company that was founded in part with an investment from In-Q-Tel. So I don't think they can really disavow the surveillance connection or concern that easily. But I do think there are some fundamental misconceptions. And one of the things I hope, obviously, with this book is that it'll clear up some fundamental misconceptions, such as, you see it all the time. I mean, people just assume that they collect the data, they store the data.
Yeah.
And it is obviously very important to get across that point to general interest readers, to the public, that that's not what they do. It is software that enables organizations to make better use of their own data.
Mm.
And why why this hasn't why this hasn't penetrated with much of the public, it seems. Well, I mean, listen, Palantir only in the last few years has it become something like a household name. People were at best vaguely familiar with it. And, listen, when I started writing the book, I mean, lots of people were like, huh, what? Who's he? What's Palantir? That has changed, obviously, just in the last 3 years. Going from, $10 a share to almost 200 will do that. But, so there's greater recognition now. Is there better understanding of what they do? Maybe at the margins, but I think a lot of people still labor under the misconception that this is a company that, collects the data, stores the data, and part of this is undoubtedly tied to, Facebook, Google, I mean, which, collect data. The business is, your data is their business.
Well,
And
that's the other thing that was. I mean, you talk a lot about in the book how Karp has a disdain for some of
yeah,
these consumer internet companies. Why do you think generally people are very quick to say Palantir is the evil boogeyman that's going to steal your data, not knowing that that's quite literally not what they do? But Facebook quite literally makes hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue per year. Why is there that
well,
dichotomy?
he recognized early on, he understood that, that he certainly understood, from the start, the nature of Facebook's business, the nature of Google's business. And he also saw that this could have implications, very negative implications for Palantir. They could get lumped in. I mean, there was, he understood that there was just disaster waiting to happen. Certainly with Facebook, and it did happen. I mean, data was, manipulated, data was, scraped and all that sort of stuff. So he understood the risks with this, and he also understood that, any company operating in this area was was in danger of being swept up in a generalized backlash against it, and so that was a very legitimate concern that he had vis-a-vis Facebook certainly, and Google as well. And so took pain, went to great lengths to try to differentiate himself. And of course, this also you know fed his hostility towards Facebook, which he describes as a carcinogen
Yeah.
and a parasitic business. He wanted to make clear that, Palantir was different. Now, why does Palantir get singled out? Well, it's because, it's because of who it works with. I mean, and that's, there's no getting around that. And, you work with intelligence services. You work with ICE. During the first, Trump administration, I mean, he made the point that Palantir was not the only tech firm working with ICE. And then that got to the complicating factor there, certainly during the first Trump presidency, was Thiel.
Yeah.
I mean, he drew a lot of attention to Palantir. Would Palantir have been, this would Palantir have been so controversial the first Trump presidency if Thiel hadn't been associated with the company? Probably not. But again, it works. The company works with clandestine services. It works with law enforcement, works with ICE. So in that sense, controversy was inevitable with Palantir.
Yeah. And, it's something that I've struggled with over the past couple of years covering the company. And struggle in the sense of I've almost seen it as a challenge of like correcting the people that would try to
Yeah.
dunk on Palantir by saying they do this, they do that. And I'm like, look, I am objectively not opposed to hearing a different perspective on what Palantir does or what they don't do. But as
Yeah.
someone who's actually studied the architecture of the software, I mean, it just doesn't feel like that's necessarily what's going on here. Even with the NHS contract, that was a very controversial contract that they ended up achieving. You're seeing the results a year and a half later of backlogs being reduced. And so you start asking yourself, do these people in the UK care more about the narrative of Palantir, or do they care more about having better healthcare?
Well, and that's a great question. And I mean, in the book, I mentioned, of course, the NHS, but look at the work that Palantir did during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of misconception, which I've tried to clear up in that discussion about what went on then. They'll talk no big contracts, and that this is somehow another sop to Thiel from Trump, and it was none of those things. Palantir made an invaluable contribution to the effort to try to get some handle on the spread of the virus, and then, of course, the vaccine rollout. I think
It was quite literally Deborah Bricks saying we need help.
we need help. It was nothing to do with nothing to do with Trump. I mean, as someone, a Palantir executive said to me in the context of another issue during the first Trump presidency, he said Trump wouldn't know how to spell Palantir. Maybe he does now, but so I mean, but again, I mean, there are these narratives, and narratives sort of take hold. I mean, yeah, for instance, I mean, just like kind of stepping back, I mean, you will still, I mean, we talked earlier, it's still referred to as Thiel's Palantir. You still see almost always in any article about Palantir, secretive. But, I mean, okay, they were very, open with me, gave me access to anyone I needed. Karp gave me, extraordinary access. But, I think you take a look at the website, there is a hell of a lot of information on their website.
Oh yeah.
You can learn a lot about Palantir by just going to their website. They were more tight-lipped in the past, and they are still tight-lipped about some things. The things they can't talk about, work with the clandestine services and so forth, and some of the military work. But I think, the secretive description really no longer applies. But again, these things just kind of take on a life of their own, and so one of the points I think I've succeeded in conveying in this book, and then I hope I've conveyed is that look, it's a complicated company. It's involved in so many different things. There are things you should be concerned about. There are things they can be criticized for. But if any fair-minded account of what this company does would also acknowledge that there are things that they have done that have been enormously beneficial. And the pandemic was one example of this. And then, as for the reaction in the UK, I think it's again, it's a lot of this is bound up in the controversy over Thiel. He didn't help in that case. He goes and gives a talk at the Oxford Union, as I recall, and says that Britain's attachment to the NHS is a form of Stockholm syndrome.
Yes.
That did not win over many people in the UK. So, and we'll get to Thiel in a little bit, I know. But, I think, there is, and more recently, of course, in the UK, there's been a real pushback because of the support that the company has given to Israel. But and this is something they have to. This is an ongoing challenge for Palantir. Sort of how do you get people to acknowledge the good work? Even if there are other aspects of what the company does that they regard as not so laudable, and that do cause controversy.
I think we would both agree, and I think Karp has said this many times, that if Palantir was in the hands of the wrong people, the software and technology is so profoundly incredible and useful and powerful that it could be used in a myriad of bad ways. Do you think that also implicates to the mystique around the company that if the software was in the wrong hands, it would be used in such bad ways that people are almost expecting and hoping that the software continuously stays in the allies of the West, as Karp would say, so that the software at least has a broader North Star than in the hands of Russia or China?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, what has been interesting, what was interesting, it was clear to me when I was doing the story for the Times Magazine back in 2019, 2020. And I think it persists to this day. And this as well. There's been like two conflicting narratives about Palantir. One is this all-powerful, technology, dangerous as hell. And there's other, there was certainly when the company was going public, you saw a lot of stuff expressing skepticism about just how good it was. And, that people saying, oh, it's just, basically a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
Usually the answer to these things is the truth is somewhere in the middle. Actually, the truth is probably it is pretty powerful software. I mean, the way I've described it is it's got the efficiency of a wood chipper and the malleability of Play-Doh. I don't know if people at Palantir would use those exact analogies, but I think it is. I mean, from talking to customers, those.
I mean, one customer told me it's like looking into the Matrix.
Yeah. I mean, those who use it swear by it. And they think it is, just heads and shoulders above anything that they can get elsewhere in the market. And so, it is powerful. And, I think, I would rephrase it slightly. And there's no avoiding politics. But I would say, and I'm showing my hand here, which, I think, one of the lessons that I think a lot of people took from the first Trump presidency was, and there was, yeah, this second Trump presidency is different in some ways, but I think the lesson was for many people that technology this powerful could be a very useful tool in the hands of an authoritarian regime, and that's not I'm not commenting on Trump so much as just as a more general comment about this would be a very powerful tool in the hands of an authoritarian regime, that a regime that was not and there is because the Karp's retort, if he were part of this conversation, would be like, look, we've got these privacy controls, we take civil liberties seriously, and they do. That is absolutely true. But as you know, it's the end user in the end who decides, how rigorously to use those privacy controls, to use those guardrails. And there have been instances where stuff has been abused, and it has nothing to do with Palantir. I mean, they sell their software. They don't monitor how it's used. Certainly not on a daily basis. So, there is risk, and Karp has been very upfront about this. And as you know, they've not sold to some they didn't sell to Saudi Arabia. The Obama administration expressed some interest in having them sell the technology to Saudi Arabia during the Arab Spring because there were fears about the stability of the Saudi regime.
Hmm.
They chose not to do it because of Saudi Arabia's human rights record, and Karp did not want to contribute to any human rights abuses. They have in the past turned down potential customers because of concerns about how it might be used. And I think, that is always, the danger with something with technology that is this powerful, whether it's on the corporate side or the government side, there is the potential for abuse and for a lot of abuse. And there's a lot of personal data that flows through their software in different places, whether on the commercial side or in the government space. And one has to be very alert to these risks, and they are. But at the end of the day, it's the customer who decides.
So let's just transition into the political conversation because I think this one is also really important. Let's start right here. You just said that the Obama administration was thinking of telling Palantir to sell their software to Saudi Arabia, and Karp said no, which implies that they've been working with the U.S. government for a long time. They were working with
Yes.
the Obama administration.
Mhm.
From my understanding, Obama 2.0 deported more people than Trump 1.0, but
Mm.
Palantir gets a pretty bad rap, especially in Trump 1.0. Why do you think a company that has worked with the government, whether it was a Democrat or Republican in office, is now being seen as the evil authoritarian use of Trump's fascism?
Well, it's a complicated question. I would say going back to the first Trump presidency, listen, as you noted, I mean, the relationship with ICE began in 2014 under
Yeah,
Obama.
yeah.
It wasn't controversial then, and Obama was deporting a lot of people. I think it was the Trump's rhetoric, and I think it was some of the stuff that was done, the child separation policy, that did not sit well with people. So there was stuff that was done under Trump that was different that was being done under Obama. So that's one thing. But I also think, look at, you know, you can't downplay, the Thiel effect. Thiel was his, Trump's biggest supporter in Silicon Valley and probably the biggest supporter in the business community in 2016. And he was not a popular figure. So a lot of this was seen through that prism. And
Mm.
so I think, yeah.
So it was a bit more narrative than reality because if they're doing the same work, and yes, there are some things that are different, but people
Yeah,
want to now associate Palantir with evilness. It's more so their disdain for Trump, you would say.
that's a big part of it, though. I mean, I will also say that, they were, because they didn't want to be associated with Trump's, immigration policy. They emphasized, early on that we work with HSI. We're not working with, the other side, enforcement and removal. And so they were saying that publicly, and then that distinction kind of collapsed because HSI was involved in some raids, and then they said, yeah, Palantir software is playing a part, but it's a very minimal part. So, I think they sort of, hurt themselves there a bit by just, disavowing any connection with, the immigration crackdown when in fact the software was playing some role in it. And again, it was, listen, I mean, how everyone feels about immigration, how everyone feels about, undocumented people. From my point of view, there was stuff done during the first Trump presidency. I mean, separating children from their parents, and a lot of kids, a lot of families haven't been reunited still. That's it's a hard policy to defend. And it's not Palantir's role to defend it, but if you're in any way implicated in that, you're gonna take some slings and arrows too. So, but I also think, Karp, we had a lot of conversations back in 2019 about this, and he made the point that other technology companies were working with ICE, and yet they weren't, being,
Chastise.
protested. They weren't being protested. The program that was directed at Palantir wasn't being directed at others. And on one hand, he took it as a backhanded compliment. He was like, it's sort of a tacit acknowledgement that the software was really good, but it also
Right.
really pissed him off because they were singling out Palantir. And I think it's, part of it is because, Palantir worked with the clandestine services, made no bones about its enthusiasm for working with the government, and in areas that kind of gave people some concern, but also, again, big part of it was because of Peter Thiel.
Well, so I've heard Karp over the past year start to stress the idea that, on the topic of immigration that we're speaking of, border control matters, and
Yeah.
having a safe and secure border is the fabric for the sovereignty of your country. And he compares it to what's going on in Germany and things that we're
Mhm.
seeing, and how it's not necessarily the best thing for the West. Um, an article came out on Axios a couple of days ago that it was titled "Karp has gone full MAGA," and Karp responded to this by saying the person who wrote the article, you, who also wrote the book, is filled with TDS, even though you're a good person. So just straight up, I want to ask you the question. You're talking about immigration and borders, and if Karp was in this conversation right now, he would say, well, a healthy border really does matter, and
Yeah.
that's not
Yeah.
political. That's just like, hey, do we want
Yeah.
illegal
Yeah.
immigrants taking away jobs, things that.
Yeah.
Do you have TDS, and did that impact how you write the book?
All right. I'm not gonna avoid your question. I'm gonna get to your question, but the first thing I would say is, like, look at his views have evolved on this issue. You go back and look at the stuff he said to me and others, during the first Trump administration. He said to me, I am totally in favor of I'm totally fine with the demographics of this country changing if it's changed through legal immigration. No issue with that. His views have evolved on that. He believes that the 2024 election was a vote to keep the demographics of the country the same. And hence he has no qualms now about supporting ICE. He did have some qualms in 2000 during the first Trump presidency, and in fact said that if he had known what was going to happen, he might not have signed the contract with ICE.
Hmm.
So, that was the first Trump presidency. So his views have evolved. I would say that, when he says Trump derangement syndrome, I think part of this is because, in the book, I'm dredging up stuff he said about Trump, when Trump, first became a candidate in 2015. And Karp said some pretty harsh stuff. He made very clear he was not a supporter. And it's now, Trump is president now again. And it's, listen, the way it works is the first rule of business in Donald Trump's Washington is don't piss off Donald Trump. The second rule is do what you can to ingratiate yourself with him.
But
Um,
to push back on that real quick,
sure.
one thing that I've spoken to about other tech CEOs, some of them have, I've spoken to one CEO privately who's the CEO of a company worth $120 billion, and he told me the Democrats gave up on everything he cared about, which
Mm,
primarily was rooted in crypto and AI. And this is a guy who's a
yeah.
lifelong Democrat.
Yeah.
So for him to advance his business to one day become $1 trillion company instead of $100 billion company, he
Yeah.
needs to be on the side of the people that are sensible around crypto and AI. And what we've seen with the Genius Act over the past couple of months, we have some really meaningful crypto regulations that are not the Gary Gensler
Yeah.
anti-federal stances
Yeah.
on crypto. Do you think it's not Palantir evolving to keep their business in the right space, which of course that plays a part of it,
Yeah.
but Karp realizing that the Democrats just aren't ready to evolve as a
Well,
party?
I think listen, I think and listen, yeah, I'd be curious to see how my book gets reviewed, if it gets reviewed in sort of progressive journals, because I'm fully expecting there'll probably be a harsh reception in some places that I was too fair to Karp. I mean, these are people who don't really like him, don't really like Palantir, don't like billionaires. But I think, and I hope that'll be read with an open mind because, when you go back and, Karp said, he said this to me in 2019, one of our conversations, it's quoted in the book. He said, look, you know, I don't think people are against immigration. They're not happy with illegal immigration. They don't like scenes of chaos at the border. And either you take their concerns seriously or they're going to turn to politicians who do take their concerns seriously.
Right.
And I would think that, I'm a progressive. I don't mind saying that. That's where my sympathies lay. And I would say, looking at, you know, we're now in the second, Donald Trump is president again. And I think, it would be sort of hard to argue that he was wrong about that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's, there was, we've got two elections now, and if you weren't happy with, if you weren't happy with the first Trump presidency, the border was an ongoing issue, and now you've got a second Trump presidency. So I
And the
think,
second one was a mandate given the swing states that he won, I think.
well, he did. I mean, he won a significant victory. I think it's less of a mandate than people, but give it, but he won, and and that's it's very clear that voters, polling now is like, I think, polling clearly indicates that people are not really happy about how this is being done now. But I think the views on immigration seem a little more subtle than, it's not that people are against immigration, but they don't like scenes of chaos at the border. And Karp back in 2019 said, look at, you got to take this stuff seriously. If you don't, you're not going to like what happens. And I think it would be very hard, for anyone who's fair-minded about it to say, well, he was wrong about that. And so, I don't think crypto or anything like that is of concern to him or not particularly concerned. What's paramount to him, the things that matter to him are national security, are, the border clearly, and just, and I think, he believes him, and we can get to October 7th later. That was a very big factor in his thinking. But I think, his evolution politically certainly goes back to the first Trump presidency. He did not, he's saying this, he's saying, you got to take this stuff seriously or the voters are going to turn to people who do. And instead of listening to him, people are protesting Palantir. So I think he was, quite perturbed that his fellow progressives, had turned on Palantir, had turned on him, had made them, these, out to be these evil figures. And so that, sort of pushed them away. And then, there was, the stuff that happened in New Orleans, which I'll talk about with the book. I mean, there's a lot of controversy about their work with law enforcement. And a lot of that controversy was, probably overblown because they didn't really do that much work
Yeah.
with municipal police departments in the United States. It wasn't a very successful effort for them. And now they're not working with any municipal police departments in the United States. And it's a very complicated issue, as Karp himself said. I mean, there's a history of racialized policing, a lot of concern about data-driven policing. In New Orleans, though, I mean, it was, New Orleans had an epidemic of homicides, and 90% of the victims were black, 90% of the perpetrators were black. I mean,
Yeah.
that was, the truth was in the data. Palantir gave its software to the city free of charge to help try to reduce the murder rate. And the whole thing erupted in controversy because, Palantir, was accused of, helping, facilitating predictive policing that was unfairly targeting minority communities. And this really incensed Karp because, he was just like, this is, this was a case in his view where they were unequivocally on the side of good.
Yeah.
And actually not the people who were potentially benefiting from Palantir, from the use of Palantir software in the city, but from progressives who were far removed from the neighborhoods in New Orleans that were seeing all this carnage. Those people made us think about this, and so that was another thing that really sort of alienated him from the Democrats, or started his his move away from
So as he's moved away from like full on progressive, which he was his entire life, and he has acknowledged that, you've acknowledged that. The title of that article was "He's now gone full MAGA." So the question then comes down to: Has he as a progressive gone? Has he as a progressive gone MAGA, or have the progressives like yourself have a massive case of TDS that aren't looking at reality?
Well,
Who's right here?
Well, I mean, listen, I mean, what he would call, what he would describe in the book as TDS. And I think it's slightly exaggerated. There's not that much, but I would say it's pro-truth, not TDS. But that's, opinions may vary.
That's what a person who has TDS would say. That's
Um, I think listen, um, I think, he would say a couple things. I think and you've heard this. I mean, this was true. He's not a neocon. He takes pains to emphasize he's not a neocon. But like the neocons of the 60s and 70s, he would say that he didn't lead the left. The left left him.
exactly. Yeah.
So there's that. I would say that he has, during the first Trump presidency, he made very clear he did not like Trump. He did not want Trump as president. He didn't, he made his disapproval loud
He,
and
he even
clear.
endorsed Harris to an extent, I think.
Yeah, well, he did. I mean, I think,
But he
but
knew she wouldn't win, is was the other.
well, he was pretty coming. He kind of, after Biden, stepped aside and she became candidate. I mean, we had a conversation. It was in August. It was after the Democratic convention, and he thought, she'd had a really good convention. He thought, okay, maybe she could win by election day. By the weekend before the election, he was like, he didn't think she would win. He wasn't sure, but he still thought Trump would win. But I mean, yeah, okay, so he supported. But I think, if he supported her, it was very reluctantly. He was not
Yeah.
an enthusiast. And Trump wins. And look at, I mean, if you're a company that does business with the US government and they do a lot of business with the government, you sort of have to get on board here. But I would say in contrast to some other tech executives, I won't name names, but you know who I'm referring to, the opportunism kind of drips off them like sweat. Um, you know, he he found reasons to get behind. It's not just because you have to, but there are things that that he find that he approves of now. I mean, he's now a hardliner on immigration. He, and I talk about that extensively in the book, and he's much more in line now with Peter Thiel's view. He he's changed his mind about it, not just because he sees Trump's second election victory in 2024 as a vote to keep the demographics of the country the same, but he also sees it through the prism of October 7th, what happened in Israel, what he saw as an outbreak of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And before October 7th, he saw immigration as a toxic issue for the Democrats. After October 7th, he also sees it as a toxic issue for American Jews.
Right.
And this is a part of the book that I think is going to generate a lot of conversation and a fair amount of controversy. He spoke with, I mean, that you read it. I mean, is that your take as well?
Yeah, I think let's just transition then to the Israel conversation here.
Yeah,
So I thought this was a pretty nuanced part of the book. Obviously, Karp is Jewish and he saw the atrocities of October
yeah,
7th, equivalent to 50,000 people in the United States.
yeah,
He's always been explicitly Jewish. He never hides away from it. If someone asks him, he'll talk about it. And this brought back the sense of, well, we've always said never again, and
yeah,
now it's happening.
yeah.
At the same time, you have some quotes in the book that says Karp wouldn't mind if Netanyahu, let's just say, wasn't the president, given there might not be a full alignment between everything the Israeli government has been doing in Palestine. So I guess the question here is, we'll just start it off with, what do you think happened on October 7th that really got Karp to take out an advertisement in the New York Times and say, we stand with Israel?
Well, I think this gets back to the point I made earlier. The key to understanding Karp is this sense of vulnerability that he's had, from a very young age. And again, even with the wealth he has amassed, even with his, vast security detail, he still has this sense of vulnerability. And October 7th, I mean, this pogrom in Israel, shook him, as it shook many Jews. I mean,
Yeah.
it was the largest, killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And he, again, he always knew that anti-Semitism was a powerful force in the world, that Jews were vulnerable, but this really, in a way that not in his lifetime, not in mine, brought home the danger. And again, do not discount the fear factor for him. I mean, this is this is essential to understanding Palantir. As he told me way back in 2019, his fear drives a lot of what makes this company what it is. And so, this was just a huge event for, a seismic event, obviously for the world, huge for Palantir, and on a personal level, a major, major event for him, and something that, shook him to the core, and you know, galvanized him in all sorts of ways. And he was very outspoken about, about what happened, and from the start, and was frustrated that other people weren't speaking out. He talked about that with me. It's in the book. I mean, he's very frustrated that other leaders in the business community are not speaking up, or not expressing support for Israel. He says, "Why am I the only one?" And so he really goes,
Why do you think that pissed him off so much?
because he thought that they were being cowards, that, he
Hmm.
believed that many of them, agreed with him 100%, but just didn't, as he said, they didn't want to be screamed at by college kids. They want to be screamed at by, people who were unhappy with Israel. And so, they just want to keep their heads down. And that's obviously not the way he does things. He doesn't keep his head down. And in this case, he certainly didn't, but it irritated him. And this is, I think the chapter on Israel is, this sort of real key to understanding how he got here, because, this is where you see him not just wrapping his mind. I mean, he's pretty convinced that Trump is going to win. So this is, 2023, we're having these kind of, 2023, 2024, we're having these conversations. He's pretty convinced that Trump is going to win. But this is where you start to see him, like, sort of like getting on board with Trump.
Right.
That's where he is all but saying that he thinks, a Trump victory would be better for Israel, and that, American Jews would be safer under Trump. And I think that's where you kind of see it. I mean, there's this conversation we have, it's like a week or two after October 7th. And, one of the other things you have to understand about Karp is he likes to argue. Um, that's, he likes to, I mean, and that's been integral to Palantir's success. I mean, like from the
The
start.
intellectual sparring really matters.
It is, but like, at Palantir, it was like from the start, like there needed to be an open discourse. You need to have, people need to be able to speak candidly, frankly, push back hard, even against the CEO. I mean, as Aki Jain said to me, Karp's view is you should be able to tell even the CEO to go fuck himself.
Yeah.
And and out of this very intense hothouse atmosphere, people batting around ideas, pushing back hard against things they thought were wrong, you would, develop superior products, and that ultimately proved to be the case. But he just likes to argue, and it's who he is. It's how he grew up. I mean, a very animated household. I mean, Matt Johnson, his cousin, tells me, he used to hear them arguing. He'd be over there for dinner. He walks out and he'd hear them from the sidewalk arguing. Karp and his parents and his brother. So this is just how it is. And he we're having this conversation in his Washington office. It's like a week or two after October 7th. And, you know, this was like interesting because, like, another thing about him is, he's very persuasive, very convincing, speaks with utter conviction. But in this case, it wasn't like me he was trying to convince. Like, he just, like, he says, like, I don't think Donald Trump's a fascist. I don't think
Mm.
he's anti-Semitic. I don't think he's a bigot and all this stuff. And there was nothing I had said. It was just more sort of him, just sort of, I felt like he was just sort of working his way into, like, saying, I can get on board. If I have to get on board with this, I can. And I do think, and certainly now I think, now, I mean, I know that he thinks that, that Trump is, having Trump as president is better for Israel in his view, and better for American Jews.
And do you think that is another reason why he has been not as fond of the Democrats anymore because of their tolerance for like supporting Hamas to an extent on college
Well, I
campuses,
mean,
for example, like as he said?
what's that?
On like so, for example, I don't think the Democratic Party as a whole supports Hamas, but you've got these elite college universities where people are protesting, some of them in favor of
Yeah,
Hamas. I mean, like, do you think
yeah.
that stuff he just thinks?
Well, I think he's sort of, I think he has sort of exaggerated. He sort of, I mean, and maybe you can chalk this up to my TDS if you want. I think and he's not alone in this. There's a tendency he tends to focus on the most extreme voices on the left, Yeah, and to, yes, to say that they're the sort of animating force in the Democratic Party, which I don't happen to think is true. Whereas he tends to look at like the voices on the far right as the outliers there, whereas like I look at that as like driving a lot of what's happening on the right. So we just have a very different point of view about that. But I do think that listen, he was supporting Biden when Biden was the candidate because Biden had given Israel basically carte blanche to do what it was doing. So he was supportive of Biden, and I think he said he supported Harris. But I do believe certainly now he thinks that if for Israel, for American Jews, it's better that Trump won. That is his.
What is your perspective on the progressive left's concern about Israel's use of military force in Gaza
Yeah.
and Palantir software potentially enabling that? I mean, I think part of the reason this whole year has been a bit controversial for Palantir is because of their software being pivotal in Israel. Karp got called out by protesters when he was speaking
Yeah.
about it. How do you reconcile as an author the fact that their software might be used for some things that might not be the best, but also Karp acknowledging that he doesn't agree with everything the Israeli government is doing, but he
Yeah.
still believes they have to support Israel?
Yeah, no, I mean, he does, and it's important here. And I mean, this is something that has not been, reported, not been confirmed. I'm confirming it in my book. I mean, because an Israeli publication, I think it was in 2024, reported that, that the Israeli military was using some AI-driven targeting programs in Gaza. And it's interesting, and this kind of gets to the point, Palantir's reputation and there was the Palantir wasn't mentioned in this article.
Mm,
And yet lots of people assumed that Palantir had to be involved,
yeah.
um, including, it turns out, the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur for the Palestinian territories, who, wrote a report about corporate complicity with Israel, which he claimed was Israel's genocide in Gaza, and named Palantir and claimed that Palantir was involved with these three AI-driven targeting programs. And the company retained a very prominent British attorney to write her a very pointed note saying, no, we're not. And it was confirmed for me separately that Palantir was not involved with these things. So there are misconceptions about, the role they've been playing. They are playing a role there. Their software is being used by the IDF, by intelligence services there. But for the targeting in Gaza, they were not being used,
Mm.
not for these AI, not through these AI-driven targeting programs. So they are again another area of misconception. But I would say that listen, he's very outspoken about this, and in a way that no one else has been. So it's not just that they're involved. There are other tech companies that are involved. Their CEOs just aren't out there speaking the way he's speaking about Israel, about what's going on college campuses. He's out there. So it's in a sense, it's not surprising that so much opprobrium has been directed at Palantir by people who are unhappy with what Israel's doing, because Karp has been very outspoken about this.
Yeah.
And then if he were here, he would say he wouldn't say that's a mistake. He doesn't care. I mean, like I think that's the one. I think that's another important thing to recognize. Like he's given up on, I think, on caring about critics on the left.
Yes.
I don't think
Yes.
I don't think he cares about that anymore. He did in the first Trump presidency. Now he doesn't.
Another geopolitical event that was pretty massive, and you discussed in the book, was Ukraine Russia. Uh,
Yeah,
Karp was one of the first CEOs to get to. I actually didn't know the story about Poland, and he had to go through all these different things. Like I didn't know how that happened, but
yeah,
he got there. He got to meet Zelensky, and then
yeah.
for a while he wasn't allowed to publicly say that their software was the reason why Ukraine was putting up a
Yeah.
fight. But then one day he said, "Screw it, we're going to let the world know." What was your take on his admiration for the Ukrainian people and for making sure their software was at the forefront of Ukraine?
Well, I think, listen, I mean, from the start, Palantir said it was about defending the West, not just the United States, about defending the West. And, it's interesting because, they're from the start, they said there are two countries we're not selling this to. We're not selling it to China and we're not selling it to Russia. And think about that, because, you're talking about, company starts 2003 and, telling, potential investors, oh, we're not going to sell in China,
It's a
the
death
world's
wish.
largest emerging market. And Palantir was a tough sell to begin with. That didn't make it any easier, I'm sure. And so those were like sort of bold, slash crazy calls. Russia less so, but certainly China. Now, of course, it's been vindicated, but that took a long time. And so, he saw both, he and his colleagues saw both Russia and China as fundamentally adversarial. And certainly when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, that was confirmation, as if anyone needed it, that it was fundamentally adversarial. And he believed, as many people said at the time, that this was a fight for, really the fight for the free world, versus, tyranny. And part of the appeal for getting involved with this, I believe, and it's quite clear. The Trump years were hard. They were hard, for Palantir. They were hard for him. Look at, I mean, the war on terrorism, the software was being, had been used in Afghanistan and Iraq, but, the whole thing had sort of become, a shit show. I mean, the war on terrorism, was, mired in controversy, Guantanamo, all this sort of stuff. So you've got that. And then you've got, obviously all the domestic controversy during the first Trump presidency, ICE and so forth. Here was a case, finally, okay, Trump is gone. And here's a case where Palantir is unequivocally on the side of good, Ukraine. And so, that was a huge relief for him, something he wanted, to call attention to, took great pride in it. But of course, they've got to be circumspect. And this is another source of frustration because, so much of their work is in the shadows. I mean, clandestine services and so forth, counterterrorism, it's, and this has been said forever, ever since 9/11, in almost 25 years since then, we rarely find out about the terrorist attacks that were thwarted. It's just like it's not shared with the public, and rightly so. But he said to me, it's been a 20-year frustration that a lot of the essential work that Palantir was doing, couldn't be recognized because it was taking place in the shadows, and that's where it was supposed to remain. So, Ukraine happens. I'm with him. This is right after the invasion. And he is now doing these letters to shareholders, to investors, time to coincide with each earnings report, and they're writing. And actually, this was I'm trying to remember if there was or if they were doing an earnings report around that. But he's in Washington, and they're writing a letter, and the letter finishes, Palantir's technologies in the fight in Ukraine, and that had to be edited out. We're in the fight,
Fight for the West. Yeah.
Fight for the West, exactly. Again, just sort of reinforcing this frustration he felt. And so what happens a couple months later, he goes to Davos, because if you remember, Davos was canceled in January of 2022 because of COVID. So they held it in May. COVID was still around, I know, because I got COVID when I got home. But I'm with him there, and there are Ukrainian officials all over. Not all over, but there are a number of Ukrainian officials there, and he meets with them, and they're obviously Palantir's supporting Ukraine, and some official said, "Would you like to come and meet Zelensky?" And Karp says to me, "I'm thinking about going to Kyiv," and I'm like, "Okay, that's great." And I'm thinking, when things quiet down, next week he's there. And that was, he wanted to show his support. He was just, he really, really liked Zelensky. The meeting was just, he really felt a kinship with him. So, and it was a way of saying to the world, Palantir's involved, and of getting, sort of, the credit that it couldn't claim for all those years and was working on counterterrorism and in the shadows and stuff, and never getting the credit he felt it deserved.
Well, I remember the stock was at $7. The picture comes out. This is June of 22. The picture comes out. So they didn't explicitly say it, but we got the picture. We got the message. And the stock is still stuck at 7. And all of us are like, are we the only ones seeing that this software probably is kind of useful here? So.
And that was a really tough time. And I mean, in the book, I'm sort of juxtaposing that because, you've got this software that is being used in the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Possibly an inflection point for the West. And Palantir is, Karp is becoming like, that's kind of where his public role changes. I mean, he decides to stop referring to himself as the batshit crazy CEO because he's like become this sort of statesman CEO.
Yeah.
And, people want to hear from him. He's got, he goes to, the Baltics, he's getting police escorts from the airport. So he kind of, he's occupying this very different sort of role now. and yet, the stock is like, below the price at which it opened. And I think it was a source of, again, I mean, Palantir will say, well, we won't watch the stock price. Well, that's not really true. Of course they were. And it's just, it was very frustrating, I would imagine, to, see, the kind of valuable work you're performing and the value the market seemed to be placing on that work, which wasn't very much. So on the one hand, it was a very heady time for him, a very gratifying time for the company in some sense that it was, so integral to this major, major issue. And yet, also very frustrating because, listen, the stock price is a way of keeping score and it was, languishing at a very low price while all this was happening.
Yeah, and that's where the real army that saw the value in Palantir, you know,
Yeah.
began to just buy more and see what was
Well,
happening.
that's the thing. I mean, he had, developed this retail fan base after the company goes public, and then, they were, standing behind him. But, obviously, institutional investors, Wall Street analysts, his friends on Wall Street, not so, smitten with the Palantir narrative.
Right. Let's talk about Thiel. So you
Yeah.
spent a good part of the book talking about the relationship with Thiel and Pound and Karp. One of the first videos I did on YouTube when I was covering the company back in 22 was a libertarian and a socialist
Yeah.
somehow create a tech company. Why do you think they were able to get along in the early days?
Well, listen, I mean, they formed this friendship at Stanford Law. They met at Stanford Law. They both had been philosophy majors as undergraduates. They matriculate to Stanford Law in the fall of 1992. No, fall of 1989, excuse me. So right after graduating, Peter Thiel from Stanford, Karp from Haverford, and they both kind of quickly discovered that they don't love law school. It's just not, Karp said he knew within a week it had been a mistake. Thiel was a little, less critical early on, but they're both not really happy there. So they bonded over their shared disdain for law school, their love of chess, and their love of political combat. And their dorm room bull sessions were pretty epic. They both told me. I mean, Karp had was on the left, Thiel was libertarian, and as Karp put it, they argued like feral animals. But a friendship was born out of that, and so they lost touch after graduating from Stanford Law. Karp goes off to Germany to pursue his doctorate. Yeah, almost everyone who was with them at Stanford who knew what Karp was doing was like, why would you do that? That's nuts. Why aren't you going to pursue a legal career? Thiel was the only one who thought it was a good idea. He's like, oh,
Right.
go for it. And so, he encouraged them, but they lost touch. Then they reconnect after Karp comes back to the United States, in the early 2000s, and he's back in the United States, and he takes a job as a development officer for a Jewish philanthropy in San Francisco, and they reconnect. Um, he has Thiel come to a meeting of donors. Thiel, as Thiel explained to me, it was a meeting of donors to this organization, and Karp invited Thiel there because he thought, and apparently these donors would go after each other pretty hard during these meetings, and he thought if a non-Jewish guy was there, it might make things a little more civil. I don't know if that's the case, but Thiel is very quickly comes to realize that his friend is really good at raising money,
Yeah.
and really good at working a room. As another Karp friend, from Haverford put it to me, his superpower is reading a room, and Thiel sort of saw this. Um, Thiel's starting this company called Palantir, and he's got some guys from PayPal and working on a prototype, and wants to raise money for it. So he gets Karp to do some moonlighting for him, and then of course they're looking. Initially, Thiel thought it would have for the CEO position. He thought they would need he thought it was someone ex-military, someone with some stature in Washington. They interviewed some people. They just weren't great fits. Stephen Cohen, Joe Lonsdale, and Nathan Gettings, meanwhile, are working, with Karp, and they're like, maybe this guy's it. And they go to Thiel and say, we think he's it, and that's how Karp became the CEO. And his politics were very different than Thiel's. They had more agreement than people might have realized. And maybe about just you know about why the public was losing faith in institutions, about trends in higher education. So there were there were some they had similar views on some issues, but for most of Palantir's history, the fact that they were political opposites was a source of great intrigue. This relationship between them was a source of a lot of intrigue, in the tech community and beyond. And the fact that they were political opposites accrued to Palantir's benefit in a lot of ways
Right.
because people were like, you look at it and say, okay, this company working in the national security space, but it's got this neo-socialist as its CEO, and so whatever concerns people had about Thiel's views, and he had become increasingly political and had expressed views that were often quite controversial. The fact that you had Karp as the CEO kind of disarmed some of the people who might have been suspicious of Palantir, might have been critical of it. It sort of softened the image of the company. And in that sense, he was very useful as a CEO, quite apart from all the talents he brought to the job. Just this sort of yin yang thing with Thiel. And they are they're very close friends. And Karp said that he considers himself, because during the first Trump presidency, Thiel realized he had become he was obviously a lightning rod.
Yeah.
You know,
Which is why he kind of dialed it back in Trump 2.0.
well, he did, but I mean, he realized that that he had become a public relations liability for
Yeah.
Palantir, and he
Yeah.
did offer early in the first Trump presidency to step down from the board
Mm.
if it would make things easier for Karp and Palantir. And Karp said, "Hell no," because first of all, he wanted Thiel to remain involved with the company, saw his counsel as invaluable, so and wanted him to retain that formal role with the company. But he also because it would have been an act of supreme betrayal in his mind. Thiel had brought him into the company,
Right. Right.
and Thiel's support, had been absolutely critical to his success as CEO. He was more than happy to take the heat as opposed to throwing his friend overboard. But it was, Thiel, I mean, drew a lot of controversy to Palantir, as we talked about earlier. So, the sort of, it was during that first Trump presidency when, the sort of, okay, he's on the left, he's on the right, and Palantir's somewhere in the middle, and it's all good. That sort of collapsed a little bit. It becomes, a little harder to do that, and because there's some very fundamental differences between what Thiel was doing in the political realm in those years and what Karp said Palantir was doing. You have Karp saying, we're keeping the far right out of power.
Right.
And you've got Thiel supporting, candidates who I think many people would say were on the far right.
Mm.
And I'm not even referring exclusively to Trump. I'm just saying, and so, that's where it becomes, that's where it becomes a little trickier. But and now I think it's fair to say that Karp has moved closer to Thiel's worldview on some important issues. I think there's less daylight between them, certainly on an issue like immigration. And, they're both on board with Trump again. After both, Karp was not on board the first time. Thiel got, to torture this metaphor, Thiel got off board during the first Trump administration, said he wasn't going to support him. I interviewed him twice for the book. We spent about 5 hours in total talking, and those conversations were in the spring of 2023. And he said, I'm not supporting him again. And, he found his way back. And so, they're both on board now again.
Do you think, or let me ask you this question, what is your perspective on Thiel's perspective on Palantir's success? I mean, this is a $500 billion company, and Thiel has had a lot of successful investments, but he founded a company that's worth almost $500 billion. Like, does he understand it, or does he kind of just say, well, Karp was always going to do this one day because Karp is Karp?
Well, it's very interesting because in the years before Palantir went public, I mean, Thiel was very careful. I mean, he doesn't do a lot of interviews, doesn't speak a lot publicly, but never, gave no indication that he had any differences with Karp over how Palantir was performing, over how Karp was leading the company. After the successful public listing, after the company and after the stock, kind of rebounds after, you had that, if you remember, there was that, you had that spike not long after the company went public, and then it tumbles back to where it's like, 8, $9 a share. Then it languishes there. Then, you finally have the turn to profitability, and the company has been, on an upward trajectory ever since. That's when I, caught up with Thiel. I'd spoken to him for the magazine story in 2019. That's when I catch up with him again in 2023. And at that point, he's willing to acknowledge that there were some differences, and that he had some concerns about things at Palantir and how the company had operated. I mean, for instance, he said if you had told him way back in 2004, 2005 that the company wouldn't have its first profitable quarter until 2022, he said that he would have found that very surprising.
Yeah. Yeah.
He made clear that he had wanted the company to go public much sooner than Karp did.
Yeah.
So there were some differences. He said that he thought there were paths to success that Palantir might have taken that could have gotten them there faster. And then he said that he thought that the company, because and this well, the company and there's always been this narrative. It's like the pirate ship, the renegades, and like the sense that everything had to be done in a really hard way. They're fighting this epic battle against enemies. And sometimes they were. I mean, like you look at the fight over the Army battlefield intelligence system. They were fighting, a really, they were subject to some really bad behavior on the part of the Army and the Pentagon. And so, they, it's not like, this was a figment of Karp's imagination. They had some real difficult fights on their hands to just get their software in front of people, to get, people to say, to consider buying the software. So it wasn't easy. But Thiel, said there was also this thing that like just Palantir had to do things in a really hard way. And sometimes that wasn't always necessary. And the metaphor I use in the book, it's not one he used, but the metaphor I use in the book is, given a choice between, Thiel felt that, given a choice between walking through the front door and going down, trying to squeeze down the chimney, Palantir always chose the chimney.
Right.
And he attributed this to it was interesting. He said he attributed this in part to Karp's persona. He said that his riff on Karp is that he's working out this psychological thing where he needs to do things in a really, really hard way, which I guess is like that's the honest way of achieving success, in a really, really hard way. So there were these differences. Now, of course, I mean, the company is, as you said, it's a half, $1 trillion colossus. I don't think he'd be inclined to quibble with the way things have played out over the last couple of years. I would imagine he's quite delighted with where the company is, and where it's going, because obviously, and one thing we haven't discussed is, the second Trump presidency is I think Karp and his colleagues regard it as a massive opportunity for them, which is
so let's go further from there. Why do you think they believe it's a massive opportunity?
Because I think, listen, they've wired over the last 10 years, they've wired much of the federal government, but I think they see this as an opportunity. It's interesting. I mean, Karp, a while back we had this conversation, and he thought that Palantir, was poised to become to this era what IBM had been in a previous era, sort of the technological backbone for the government, for much of corporate America, and he really thought Palantir could get that there. And I think he believes that the company is probably now positioned to become so deeply embedded in the government, that it would become the de facto operating system,
Right.
in the way it has become that for like Airbus and BP. And I think he sees this as an opportunity to do that. And that's what's going on here. It's not just, what's going on with him and Trump is it's not just opportunism, and it's not just necessity. He's not just doing this out of necessity because you have to kind of placate Trump and make nice with him and say nice things. It's not just out of necessity because they've got a lot of government contracts. It's also because he sees an opportunity. And then, of course, he's also because ideologically there are things that Trump is doing, policies he's pursuing that he's on board with. So it's a multifaceted thing, but a big part of this is that he and his colleagues think there's a massive opportunity here.
Going back to Karp's ability to raise money,
Yeah.
I actually spoke with Karp a year ago, and he mentioned to me that he got this like small check from his grandpa. It was $12,000, and he
Yeah.
turned that into a lot more. One part of the book that was really interesting is when Karp said, my dream was to have a nest egg of 250,000 and go engage in German debauchery, as he would say. What is your perspective on him as a stock picker and a good investor? Because that's where Thiel gets all the credit, but
Yeah.
apparently Karp was not too bad at that.
Karp was pretty good. I mean, word got around that this guy knew how to pick stocks. I mean, he's very, very smart, very sophisticated about this stuff. I mean, he is, and he knows how to handle money. I mean, let's just put it that way. I mean, he knows how to do business. He seems to have a keen eye for investment. And he knows how to. I mean, I don't know that the way he runs Palantir, the talents he brings to Palantir. I don't know if that made him a good stock picker. I don't know that the two things are related, but he just has he has a sense of where people belong, projects they should be working on, what's going to work, what's not going to work. And I suppose that as an investor, and it wasn't a very long stint as an investor, but I suppose he had a nose for what could work, where the growth prospects were they legitimate, was there much upside to a particular stock, and so he proved to be quite adept at it. Wasn't what he wanted to do particularly. It was something he was just doing, and it's not like he had ambitions to start a hedge fund or anything like that. That's not the world. I don't actually know that. I mean, he said that he just really wanted to make a $250,000 nest egg and go and live the life of a dilettante in Berlin. I don't really know if I believe that because, it's important to understand that a lot of this stems from a lot of the ambition comes from the sense that his parents didn't fulfill their talent
Hmm.
the degree that he thought they should have. And it's an interesting family dynamic. Um, he saw his father, who's a pediatric physician, and he saw him as a very talented clinician and researcher who just didn't achieve the stature in the field that he should have by dint of his ability. His mother he saw as a very talented artist who didn't get the recognition that he thought she deserved, and and what he saw, again, he's it may sound harsh, but what he saw is his uh, overachievement became his answer to their underachievement, to what he saw
Hmm.
as their underachievement. So I'm not entirely sure that this was a guy who's going to be happy as a slacker.
Right.
I'm not quite buying that. I think it may be a little bit of self-mythologizing just to underscore how improbable his success was. I mean, he was undoubtedly going to be, he would have obviously been a successful academic. Success would have found him somewhere he would have found success. But I think one can say that the fact that he's ended up heading a major tech company, that might not have been the most obvious path for him.
What was Karp's relationship like with his mother and father separately?
It's quite interesting. I mean, he's very close with his mother. I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, getting back to the whole thing about identity, he's closer to his mother than he is to his father. The father's an interesting dynamic. I mean, at least according to Karp and his brother Ben, the father has always kind of felt, in competition with his oldest son. It's
Really?
strange.
He
Yeah.
thought Karp and his dad were competing against each other for success.
Well, the father felt somehow competitive with him, and even now, doesn't really kind of give him the credit for what he's achieved that you think he would. I mean,
Hmm.
that's what Ben Karp, Alex's brother, said. That's what Karp himself has said. Karp is, no issue with it. He is very generous with his family, including his father. He's close to his mother, but it is interesting. He's closer to his mother than his father, but it's the Jewish heritage that is the part that interests him and that he prizes the most now. So it's kind of an interesting thing.
Why do you think he never got married and had kids?
I think it's partly because his parents had a pretty nasty divorce, and it was something that affected him deeply, and I think probably colored his view of marriage, colored his view of children, of having children. And I also just think this is, when he went to Europe, you know, part of the he went to Germany to study. He went to try to he went there to pursue a doctorate. It was he wanted to pursue a doctorate because the thinkers who had most engaged him were German, but he also wanted to understand more about why the Holocaust had happened, and
Right.
his dissertation was essentially about the rhetoric of fascism. Um, he gets to Germany and just loves it. Discovers a kinship, a sense of belonging that surprises him, and just really loves being there. And then part of it too was, as he tells it, German women really took to him.
Mm.
And and to hear him tell it, he couldn't walk out his door without being dragged back to bed by lustful German women, which he
Wow.
quite liked. But apart
It's hard. It's
from
hard to get married when that part of your life is
well,
so exciting.
I think what he discovered there was a very different attitude about relationships, and a very different attitude.
Different from the United States.
Different from the United States, exactly, where it was like okay to live life as you want. You don't have to be, you don't have to be married. You don't have to have kids. You can live a different way, and it's accepted there in a way that whereas here it's you're looked at as a little bit odd.
Yes.
They're different, and it's something that really made I think a big impression about on him, and that ultimately led him to say, "This is how I want to live my life." Now, I will say that when I was doing the story for the Times Magazine in 2019, he was kind of apologetic for the fact for his lifestyle. I mean, he was he felt that it was a liability for Palantir. He thought he was absolutely the ideal person to lead the company internally, but he thought the fact that he wasn't a standard issue CEO was a liability for the company. The fact that he quite apart from not having the blow dried hair and and just not looking like a standard CEO or talking like one, the fact that he didn't have a wife and kids, was to Palantir's detriment. He changed his mind about that after taking the company public.
Mm.
Then he was just like, not only is it good that I can devote myself to Palantir in a way that someone with a wife and kids wouldn't be able to, but he was just like, this is how I live my life, and I'm not making any apologies for it. So, it's that's kind of how he's ended up, and I would say that he lives life as he wants to. And I would also say this, I mean, and you've studied tech executives, you watch them closely. I think there are some who it's very clear are fundamentally not happy people despite
Yes.
their success.
Yes.
He's a happy person. He's content with his life. And I think that's another key point that needs to be understood. He likes his life. And he's living it as he wants. And it's not even the money. I mean, yes, the money has made it easier for him to live his life as he wants, but it's not like he lives a really lavish life despite all this money. Yeah, he's got a lot of homes, but the homes are not palatial. He hasn't. He bought a plane. He leased one before, but it's not like he's buying up art, not that I know of anyway. It's not like, he kind of lives the way he did before. In fact, his cousin Matt Johnson said, something, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something to the fact that never has more money been wasted on one person because
Yeah.
he lives a kind of, a fairly simple existence. But he's very happy living the way he does. And I think he's very content with this.
It goes to this quote that you have from Karp on page 204. I fantasized about being non-conforming, but I don't know how to do that. I just don't know how to do it. I don't know how it works. I wouldn't know how to be non-transgressive. I try really hard. I do, but it's not working out.
Yeah. And that was like a shocking thing to hear from a CEO of a major company. Because I mean, in 2019, Palantir was a major company. And that's what I'm talking about. That's where, it was like it was, this was before the company had gone public. And it's interesting too, because you talk to him, you talk to, Sham, you talk to others with the company. I mean, like even in 2019, when it seemed to be a quite good company, it had $40 billion valuation at that time, you know. They were just like we're still not sure that the company was going to make it.
Right.
So, there was still a fair amount of doubt in their minds. They were not sure they'd gotten to the other side of the river. Yeah, and so and when he says this, I mean, it was quite a shocking thing to hear. We were sitting in his New York office, and he's saying this, um, but I think that's how he felt. I think he felt like that the way he lived was probably a liability for the company. He just was not your typical CEO, and who's living a different kind of life, and at least maybe in Europe it wouldn't have been much of an issue, but he saw it in the United States as a liability, I know he wouldn't say that same thing now. He doesn't, it's just he doesn't feel that way now. I think he's much more comfortable with the choices he's made in life, and as I said, he's fundamentally a happy person.
The other co-founders, Nathan Gettings, Cohen,
Yeah.
Lonsdale, do you think their role in Palantir is not talked about enough?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Cohen is obviously an integral part of the company, a
Yeah.
very important figure now. He is, and it's quite amazing. Like he's a guy who's never gotten out of startup mode. I mean, it's just like, he wears the same jeans, the same black, polo shirt. He's like, eats peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for lunch. He still pulls all-nighters. I mean, like he is like in startup mode, even though he himself is now a billionaire.
Yeah.
So, and obviously very involved, and certainly with AIP, an integral part of the move into that. Gettings, he was, very important to getting this thing off the ground. I mean, he and Cohen,
Built the first
did
prototype.
the prototype exactly. And Lonsdale was an important part of this too. I mean, it's interesting, one of the things, because Palantir, as you know, for many years didn't have salespeople.
Yeah.
And it was a conscious decision. Partly it was because they recognized from the start that they had the best salesperson in the world in Karp. So there was that, but it was also because they understood early on that if you have salespeople, they kind of take over the culture. And in Palantir's case, that would have been bad because they're trying to make a very sophisticated product. They're trying to build this very sophisticated software that goes beyond stuff that's in the market, that includes these privacy controls and all that sort of stuff. You bring in salespeople, they're going to want to get product out the door, and they're going to have they're going to want they're going to force you to push stuff out sooner than you want. And then you hear Karp talk about now, he's always talking about thin software, and he sort of he says there's a sort of inverse relationship. The more salespeople a company has, the thinner the software. And they understood this early on. But when you hear Lonsdale say it now, it's like, okay, that makes sense. But then you realize that the guy was like 21 or 22 at the time.
Yeah.
Like, that's some business chops, you have to say. I mean, to understand this as like a kid at that age, I mean, they were all kids. I mean, Karp was older, but like, hearing this from Lonsdale now, like I said, I mean, realizing he was like 21 years old at the time and understanding, okay, salespeople could really screw us. That was pretty impressive. So, he had obviously a big role. I mean, the software platform that didn't succeed was Metropolis, and
Yep.
he was behind that. And that was not, the product itself was not really a problem. I mean, people who used it or familiar with it said it was actually pretty good, but it was small ball, and that was a mistake. And Karp pulled the plug on it. But
This was for the
so
financial firms, correct?
that was exactly right. That was
Yeah.
exactly right. And it was very painful because you had some very talented people working on that. And then, they all subsequently left. That was a setback. And I mean, so, this company is, we look at it now and say tremendous, but it was a long road to get here.
One thing that a lot of people have been trying to understand about Palantir is at its core, Karp talks very philosophically about an ontology because
Yeah.
it is a philosophical term. In fact, one of the reasons I got into Palantir is because I studied philosophy in high school and
Okay.
ontology,
Yeah.
continental philosophy, Immanuel Kant. Like I recognized that term for so many
Yeah.
years. And then I'm looking at Palantir, like they describe their data as an ontological structure of a
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
How do you think Karp has more broadly taken philosophical ideas and connected them to the business to the point where a shareholder letter comes out every quarter written with all these quotes from German philosophers? Some people are turned off by it. They're like, dude, just give me the numbers. I don't get it.
Yeah.
Someone like me and a lot of other retail investors like, oh my goodness, he's speaking in a way that's almost like you would study these letters in 100 years in Harvard
Yeah.
School. How do you think about the
Yeah.
philosophy and the business in and of itself?
Well, I think it's an important part of it. I mean, listen, I mean, again, no background in computer science, and yet, there was this sort of this overlap with ontology being part of it. I mean, that the sort of the way that the engineers thought about organizing data and sort of constructing a worldview. It wasn't as big of a leap for him
Yeah.
as it might have seemed. So, and you talk to the you talk to some of the guys, some of the software engineers who were there from the early days. Um, Aki Jain, for instance, would say that the way he wrote, the way he thought, even if they were sort of talking different languages, there was a sort of technical structure to the way Karp thought and
Yes.
talked and wrote that resonated with them. They could see something very similar to how they thought about things, how they addressed problems, how they tackled things. So internally, it was there was a certain overlap there that made it possible for him to connect with these people and they with him. That might not have been apparent. You just kind of look at this and say, well, how is this guy going to run this company? So that how's he going to talk to these software engineers? And so there was a sort, they were not from completely different worlds, and obviously, look, he comes from this background in the humanities. I think it was very helpful for Palantir in the sense that, look, he thinks this is someone who really could think through the implications of the work on a broader scale than, you're talking about a bunch of young software engineers. I mean, besotted with coding. I mean, these are guys who are not thinking about, it's important to point out that, okay, we now talk all about privacy, civil liberties. I mean, those were very important discussions when Palantir came along because, of course, it was after 9/11, after the Patriot Act. These are real concerns. But I mean, this was before, I mean, it's a couple of years before the iPhone is introduced. I mean, before, just this explosion in personal data. So these guys are like really ahead of the curve in some ways. And, Karp was very alert from the start to the risks and to the importance of, sort of, you know, creating this powerful software, but, also we need to do it in a way that can protect privacy and civil liberties.
And
And
only
it
a
was
philosopher would have that much of a focus at 35 years old.
Well, to think about these broader implications, to understand, and to be able to talk. And I think it also, I think in some way, his involvement with the company, the fact that he was CEO, probably gave some people some assurance
Yeah.
that okay, this wasn't going to be just some totally nefarious product, and that there was someone at the switch, if you will, who understood the risks here and wanted to address them. And of course, I mean, the way he thinks about things. So, like he has this idea that, well, because the discussion after 9/11 and when Thiel has this idea for, okay, maybe we can, picking up from what PayPal did, maybe we can develop software that can help the government fight terrorism and make use of the data they've got. And Karp has this, idea, well, there's the technology side of this, and the technology should be very powerful and help, intelligence analysts find those needles in the haystack. But, like, how do we protect civil liberties and privacy while doing that? And Karp has this idea that there's, this sort of, technological solution to the problem posed by the technology. You could actually embed in the software these controls. And as he put it, it's like, this sort of Hegelian solution, as he put it, So these two seeming opposites, and you kind of come to, a synthesis where you could actually produce software that would allow the analysts to get the information they need, but at the same time protect the data of millions of innocent people who should not be pulled into the dragnet. And that was his idea. And I think there was, the idea that, he thought about this as sort of this Hegelian solution. And maybe it's a little simplistic, but I think that's kind of how he thought and about, and where you might see the philosophic background coming into play from early on. And listen, I mean, he is he's a credentialed scholar. He worked for a time with the most celebrated living philosopher, Jürgen Habermas,
Yeah.
and certainly in Europe, I mean, this was a big deal. I mean, I remember talking to Tom Enders, the former CEO of Airbus, And he was just like, he was talking to me. He and Karp had gotten to know each other at Davos, and then Palantir comes in to help them with a production glitch with the A350, and that's the beginning of the relationship. And Enders, you know, Enders is just like, he's talking about it. He said it was one of the best decisions he had made at Airbus to bring in Palantir. But, we're just talking about Karp. He said, yeah, and I knew he studied with this very important philosopher. It's a huge calling card in Europe and so forth. And
It makes
something
it
that
easier to do business in Europe, you would say.
it seemed to. It made him a source of great intrigue, not just to other CEOs, but also the European press. And it's certainly a figure here. I mean, you look at the interest in his dissertation, the stuff, there's been stuff written about it. Obviously, that's a function of the fact that he's become so prominent and rich. But I think it's certainly a little different. And how he thinks about things is very different. I would say, just as a more general comment, I mean, you know, conversations with him are really interesting. You've spoken to him, and you know, he likes to argue. We've argued about a lot of stuff. He gets annoyed if you don't argue it. Like, he and I would have conversations, and I'd be saying this, he'd be saying that, and I'd say something like, "Well, who cares what I think? This isn't about me." And that would sort of like annoy him. He was like,
Hmm.
"No, let's go at it." And and I think, this is, he comes from the academic world, the world of ideas, and this is, this is who he is. It's, and it's a differentiator. It's a differentiator in the business world, certainly.
It really is. I mean, earlier this year at one of the AIP cons, I met him, and the first thing he asked when he saw me was a philosophical question.
Yeah.
And I was, and he's like, let's go for a walk. I want to hear your perspective. And his security guards were like, Karp, if you want to go for a walk, we got to go this way. We cannot just go out there. He's
Yeah.
like, all right, Amit, come
Yeah.
with us. And then
Yeah.
so we're out there and we're going for a walk and we're in the elevator and I'm listening to his stuff. And like the fact that he even cared about my opinion,
Yeah. Yeah.
he's an inquisitive guy who it doesn't matter if you're you know, some random engineer that just joined Palantir, you're the CEO of Airbus. He wants to know your perspective.
No, he's interested in what other people think, and how he thinks is quite interesting. And as I said, we've spent a lot of time together over the last 5, 6 years, and a lot of conversations. And I told him this at one point. It was very interesting. We have some fundamental disagreements about stuff, and enjoy battling and so forth. But I would find myself on the drive home or on the train ride home if I'd seen him in Washington or New York. I find myself like kind of continuing the argument. Of
Yeah.
course, he's not there. We're just
Yeah.
continuing the argument. And
Yeah.
and and I think that that is like and I found it quite interesting. And I think it's a sign that maybe I like arguing too. But he gives you stuff to think about. He thinks about things in a very different way. And you talk to people who knew him in college and in law school. He thinks about things in a very different way and in an often very interesting way. And even if you don't agree with him, it gives you something to think about, and it forces you to sort of challenge your own, to think through your own ideas and so forth. It's sort of steel manning, to use one of his favorite phrases these days, steel manning your own arguments, and
Yeah.
that's quite interesting. And again, I don't think that's very common in the business world, and certainly not at the level where he is. I mean, most of these guys really only like to hear themselves talk, and are not really interested in having people push back against their ideas or engaging in battles of ideas. And he still has that. He didn't go into academia, but he still has some of that spirit.
He's mentioned in an interview a couple months ago of Palantir's market cap going into the many of
Yeah.
trillions. Do you think that he loves the success? He loves the not the financial rewards, but rather the people like me that ended up buying in early and made a name for myself and
Yeah.
and financially changed my life. Do you think he loves that part of the story? Do you think he wants that to keep going? And do you think he also loves that the analysts, the professionals that got it wrong, are so wrong that he looks so right, and it almost is this like victory of a lifetime that he proved
Yeah.
wrong?
Yeah. Well, I think he certainly, feels very vindicated, and he's happily spiking the football these days, and he's not going to stop. He's like, he was very mean. He's, he has, been down on institutional investors, for many, many years. This goes back to the rough reception he received on Sand Hill Road,
Yep.
and when going out to try to raise money for Palantir, and basically they all said no. Some were nicer about it than others, and so that kind of gave him some hostility towards institutional investors that then carried over to Wall Street analysts, certainly after the company goes public. And listen, the stock was not doing well.
Yeah.
Company hadn't turned a profit years, 18 years in, and it still hasn't turned a profit. And so, it's not like the skepticism was totally unfounded, but he felt that in contrast to people like you, Wall Street analysts didn't understand Palantir and were never going to understand it. And he was done trying to explain it to them. So there is this victory lap that, he's sort of on now, and he feels vindicated. And, he's not going to stop dunking on them for a while yet, is my guess. But I would also say that, I think he believes that Palantir's best days are still to come. I mean, because the thing is, it's like, look he's in his late 50s now. He's keeping up this crazy schedule. And yeah, it's easier for him in a sense because he doesn't have a wife and kids. And so he can live like this, but it's still a pretty backbreaking schedule. I mean, he's rarely in the same bed, more than one or two nights at any time.
Yeah.
He's on the road constantly. But I think it's because he loves what he does. I mean, this company is his life's work. And I also think because he believes, the best is still to come for Palantir, and he wants to be there for it. As much as he likes to be out in the cross-country skiing trails, I don't, I think he thinks, it's 20 years to get to this point. He feels like, the best is still to happen, and he wants to be there for it.
Last question for you, Michael. Again, thank you for all the time you spent with me today. So I saw this last night, and I was well, I don't know if I should say thank you, but my mom was definitely pretty happy about this. I didn't know my name would be in the book.
It's there. It's there.
It is there in the epilogue, and what you wrote is exactly correct. When you arrived that afternoon in December, Karp and I were in conversation, and
Yeah.
then another person came up, and so first of all, it was just really cool for me to see my name get immortalized in a book like this, and so I do thank you for that. That means a lot. And I guess the only reason I was there for you to even write about that situation is because the company has embraced the retail investor, and
Yeah. Well,
particularly.
I mean, you are obviously, you are, obviously the best known, among retail investors of Palantir, those who've gotten, on board with Palantir, those who have, become Karp fanboys, if you will. You
Yeah.
are, the best known. And sort of, you symbolize sort of, I mean, because this is a really important part of the story. I mean, he just
Which was going to be my question, by the way. Why do you think the retail investor embraces Palantir? That's my last question.
Well, because I think they find him to be an authentic figure, a figure of they find him entertaining. He's very funny. You see him on TV. He just says what he thinks. So there's the authenticity factor, and he would say that they understood the Palantir story in a way that analysts didn't. I mean, and they understood it in a very simple way. This is the company on the side of the United States in the West, and they want to see it succeed, and were willing to put their money where their sentiments lay, and believe that the company would succeed, and bought his explanation for what the company was doing, where it saw opportunities, and I think it's at a time when institutional investors were skeptical, Wall Street analysts were very skeptical. There was this community of retail investors who, said Papa Karp, Daddy Karp, all that sort of stuff. And just, he liked that. He found that, very endearing, and excuse me, he found that very appealing. And more importantly than just the ego gratification, it was, the fact that there was this community of investors who bought the story.
Yeah.
And who said, okay, yeah, the stock's at $7 or $8 now, but I think it's going up. I think there is something to this. Companies that, organizations that use the software swear by it. I mean, you guys knew in a way that, you knew. I mean, when you've got 40,000 people at Airbus using the software on a daily basis, product is legit.
Right.
And even if Wall Street analysts were discounting that or just not paying it, giving it the weight it deserved, there was an investment community that understood that that's a pretty significant achievement, and that spoke not just to the quality of the software, but to the potential for this technology. That if it was that integral, if it had become that integral to a major corporation, and if it was that integral to the U.S. military, that there was a lot of upside here, and that it was worth putting some of your money in at 7, 8, 15, 25, 45. $100
$100.
now. Exactly.
No.
So I think that was a big part of it. And then obviously, I mean, you know, you emerged as someone who got on board in a very public way, and you see it with the earnings call. I mean, it's the retail investors he wants to hear from.
Yeah. Yeah.
He'll throw the mic to a few, Wall Street analysts, a few investment bank analysts, but it's the retail investors, and he says, this is, he says now. I mean, when he, talked, when the company was, you know, got into the S&P 500, he releases that video and he said, this belongs to two groups, Palantirians and our retail investors.
Right.
That's obviously the professional investment community is now very heavily in the stock, and they've bought the story, but he has clearly not forgotten who bought the story when it was a harder story to buy.
All right. Michael, last question for you. What do you want people to take away from the book over the lifetime of people reading it?
Well, I think there are a couple different things. I think it's a really interesting business story. I mean, and you can see, you know, the importance of this as a business story, not just in the fact that it's, the company has this, this massive valuation now, but in what it has spawned. I mean, the number of companies that have come out of Palantir, and you can also see it in the explosion in interest in defense tech. I mean, Palantir paved the way for that. So, now everyone talks about defense tech, the pivot to patriotic capital, Anduril, which is quite literally the spawn of Palantir. I mean, three of the co-founders coming out of Palantir. So, I mean, this is, Palantir's impact, it cannot be overstated at this point. You see other companies now, other tech companies embracing the forward deployed model, OpenAI and others. It didn't begin with Palantir, but they sort of reinvented this role. And now you see, other companies saying, this actually makes sense, sending engineers out to work with clients and finding out not can your business be bent to our software, but can our software be bent to your business?
Right.
That, it seems kind of fundamental, but Palantir paved the way for that. So it's a quite amazing business story. And of course, the most amazing aspect of the business story is the fact that this guy with no background in business, no background in computer science, has successfully led this company to a $400 billion valuation. And that's a remarkable business story. I think you can also say that, on the business political front, if you want to understand the moment we're living in, this is a book worth reading. Palantir is at the center of everything right now. You think about the things that have dominated the headlines over the last 10 months, Doge, ICE, Israel, AI.
Yeah.
Palantir is in all of this. It's at the center of everything. I think if you want to understand, this moment, you need to know something about Palantir, and you cannot understand Palantir without understanding this very idiosyncratic and complex figure at its helm, Alex Karp. So I think, this is, I think it's better to be lucky than good. And I think the timing is really good for this book, I think. And then, I would just say that, I think, how he arrived at, his evolution politically, whether he's gone full MAGA or three-quarters MAGA or what have you, this has been a very interesting evolution. And one of the stories of this moment is how, Silicon Valley, turned to Trump and its embrace of Trump this time around. And Karp's part of that story, a major part of that story. But I think his journey there is a lot more interesting and a lot more revealing than perhaps some of these other figures. And I think, as I said, you want to understand the moment we're living through. I think this book, if I can say in all modesty, is a good way of doing that.
I love it. Michael, thank you so much. It means the world for you to take some time and talk to the audience, an audience that has been captivated by the Palantir and Alex Karp story for the past 5 years. Deeply, deeply, deeply appreciate it.
Listen, thank you very much for having me on. It was great to talk to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate
Thanks.
it.